The United States and several other countries are punishing Russian aggression by hitting the country's economy. In a speech yesterday, President Biden said the U.S. will restrict access to trillions of dollars in assets. He announced economic restrictions targeting several Russian banks, but Russian leaders may be turning to other approaches to access funds, including cryptocurrency. Michael Parker is here to explain more. He is the head of an anti-money laundering and sanctions practice at the law firm Ferrari and Associates. Thanks so much for joining us, sir. So explain how Russians could use cryptocurrency as these sanctions fall into place.
Sure. And first off the bat, I just want to emphasize that our hearts are with the Ukrainian people today. In talking about sanctions and sanctions evasion, particularly through crypto, it's important to, I guess, off the bat, think about which sanctions could potentially be evaded or avoided through the use of cryptocurrency. So if we're talking about the U.S. sanctions that were imposed yesterday, these sanctions effectively freeze out Russia from the U.S. dollar, and in many ways freeze Russia out from the global financial system because so many transactions are dollarized through New York. And what that means, of course, is that if you have two separate currencies and you want to make a transaction internationally between them, oftentimes one of the currencies will be converted into dollars before then being converted into that other currency. And so Russia is being frozen out of this aspect of the global financial system. And so the idea that overnight they could just switch to a cryptocurrency in order to fill that gap is really, in a lot of senses, impossible. First, it's just not practical. But second, and perhaps more importantly, the U.S. crypto industry has really been at the forefront of understanding this technology and understanding what needs to take place from a compliance perspective. And what do I mean by that? Well, when this was a new technology, a lot of folks sort of said, hey, cryptocurrency is going to be a new means of committing crimes. Basically, it's a string of code. It's anonymous. And you really saw the U.S. crypto industry jump into action and develop ways and tools in which to monitor, at least within the United States and on public blockchains such as Bitcoin, where this money is, where is it going, how is this currency being used, and what is it being used to fund? And you could almost think of the public blockchain, particularly with Bitcoin, as almost this trail of breadcrumbs. There are fingerprints all over it because there's new code added when transactions take place. And so the U.S. and U.S. industry really are at the forefront of making sure that we keep the crime out of crypto. A couple of examples of this, obviously, are the Heather Morgan and Ilya Lichtenstein seizure. They were the Manhattan couple that are alleged to have laundered over $3 billion worth of stolen Bitcoin. This really was a testament to the U.S. government working with industry and following the money. I mean, that really, I can't stress that enough. This is all about following the money. It's the old cliche of financial investigators. And that's with any means of exchange, whether it's as complex as crypto or as simple as cold hard cash. That really is the name of the game. Now, if we're talking about sanctions evasion outside of the United States and Russia potentially switching to alternative forms of currency, one of the scary possibilities would be if Russia and another government, another major power, sort of acted in collaboration to develop digital currencies that they could exchange between each other that were backed by each other's central bank. This would be a means of avoiding the formal banking system, and hypothetically, this would be much tougher to trace. And so in this way, Russia could potentially keep transacting and keep trading in avoidance or full evasion of U.S. sanctions.
But that sounds like something you don't just sort of whip together on a weekend, like a brand new blockchain. It sounds to me like that the people who are concerned about Russia finding an alternative route through cryptocurrency shouldn't worry that much because it's not as easy as you may think.
Well, Amber, I think that is a very good observation. Cryptocurrency may not necessarily be sort of the solution that Russia perhaps is considering, or that the global community, should sort of put as a first line concern. because there are so many of these fingerprints all over it. This may not provide the anonymity that Russia would require in order to keep transacting in the global financial system in avoidance of generally sanctions.
Michael Parker, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.